The sun was a merciless eye in a bleached white sky, and under its unblinking gaze, the Wyoming Territory stretched into an eternity of cracked earth and skeletal sagebrush. This was a land that forgot nothing and forgave even less. It was a landscape of the soul, and for Elias Thorne, it was the only home he had allowed himself for 10 long years. His ranch was not so much a property as it was a penance, a fortress of solitude built board by board against the onslaught of memory. It clung to the base of the Blacktooth Mountains, a solitary outpost of human grief against a backdrop of geological indifference. For a decade, the rhythm of his life had been dictated by the sun and the seasons, a litany of chores performed with the grim precision of a monk. He rose before dawn, the chill in the air a familiar flagellation. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness, drew water from a well that served only him, and spoke only to his horse, a stoic gray gelding named Ghost, whose silence was a comfort. Silence was the currency of this place, and Elias was a wealthy man. He had fled the noise of the world, the weeping and the platitudes, the hollow reassurances of doctors and the rustle of a burial shroud, and here he had found its opposite. But the silence of his ranch was not peace. It was a vacuum, heavy and profound, and in its depths the ghosts of his past had ample room to dance. On this day the silence was different. It was not the familiar heavy blanket of his own making. It was a taut, listening silence, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The air, usually alive with the hum of insects and the distant cry of a hawk, was unnervously still. Elias felt it in his bones, a low thrum of discordance that set the hairs on his arms to prickling. He had been splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a familiar prayer against the demons of idleness, when he first noticed it, a single dark crimson drop on the pale dust near the barn. He stopped, axe held aloft, his body frozen. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, narrowed. He was a man who noticed things. He knew the pattern of every crack in the mud-brick walls of his cabin, the unique whirl of bark on each cottonwood tree that lined the dry creek bed, the way the wind whispered a different secret through the pines than it did through the sage. And he knew blood. He had seen enough of it in his life from animals he'd hunted, from his own hands, after a carelessly mended fence, he slammed the door on that thought before it could fully form. This was not the bright, frothy blood of a wounded deer, nor the dark, slow seep of a sick coyote. This was something else. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and touched a finger to the stain. It was still tacky, fresh. He stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt peacemaker that rested on his hip, a cold and reassuring weight. His gaze followed the trail. Another drop. Then another. A staggered line of crimson punctuation marks leading from the open plains directly toward the heart of his sanctuary, the stone well. Every instinct honed by a decade of isolation screamed at him. This was trouble. Trouble had found its way through his carefully constructed defenses and was now bleeding on his doorstep. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, was to saddle Ghost and ride in the opposite direction until the sun set, to let whatever drama was unfolding play itself out without him as an audience. He had paid a high price for his solitude, and he would not have it stolen from him. But his feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to move. He followed the trail, each step deliberate and heavy, his boots crunching on the gravel with a sound that seemed deafening in the charged air. He rounded the corner of the barn, his shadow stretching long and distorted before him, and his breath caught in his throat. There, crumpled against the cool gray stones of his well, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, her body folded into itself like a broken doll. She was Apache, her heritage clear in the high planes of her cheekbones and the straight line of her jaw, now slack with exhaustion. Her dress, made of simple duskin, was torn and smeared with dirt and blood. One hand was pressed desperately against a gaping wound in her side, a wound that pulsed a slow, steady rhythm of crimson onto the thirsty ground. Her other hand, slender and trembling, was outstretched, reaching weakly for the wooden bucket that hung just a few feet above her head, an impossible distance. Her breathing came in sharp, shallow gasps, each inhale a knife's twist of pain. Her dark hair, a matted cascade of black silk and desert dust, clung to a face pale beneath its sun-darkened skin. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were open, though clouded with pain, and they tracked his every movement with the fierce, defiant alertness of a cornered wolf. There was no plea in them, no surrender. There was only a burning, unyielding will to live, a will that was currently losing its battle against the indifferent cruelty of the land. This was 1875. In this part of the territory, the fragile peace with the tribes was a thing of paper and promises, easily torn. Finding a wounded Apache on your property was not a moral dilemma. It was a death sentence, for them and potentially for you. Every neighbor within 100 miles, men who nodded to him with grudging respect in the rare event he rode to the supply post, would tell him the same thing. Put a bullet in the savage's head and bury the body deep. It was the law of the frontier, an ugly and unwritten statute born of fear and blood. Elias raised the rifle that was now in his hands, the smooth, worn stock familiar against his shoulder. He looked down the long, cold barrel, the sight aligning with the center of her chest. It was the logical thing, the expected thing, an act of self-preservation. One clean shot, and the problem would be gone. The silence would return, his solitude would be restored, and the ghosts of his past would be his only companions once more. But something in those dark, fathomless eyes stopped him. It wasn't just pain he saw there, or defiance. It was thirst. A desperate, soul-deep thirst that he recognized with a jolt that was almost physical. He had felt that same thirst during the great drought of '68, when his own well had run dry, and he'd gone 3 days with nothing but a cracked tongue and a fevered mind. He remembered the hallucinations, the feeling of his own life turning to dust inside him. It was a universal agony, a human need that transcended skin color, language, or which side of a forgotten war your people had fought on. The girl tried to speak, her lips, cracked and bleeding, parted, but only a dry, rasping whisper emerged, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. Water. The word, barely audible, shattered the cold logic in his mind. It was not the plea of an enemy or the demand of a trespasser. It was the prayer of a dying human being. With a low curse that was directed at himself, at the world, at the God he no longer believed in, Elias lowered the rifle. He leaned it carefully against the barn wall and turned to the well. His movements were stiff, reluctant, as if his body were fighting a war with his soul. His neighbors would call him a fool. His long-dead father would have called him soft. Hell, maybe they were right. He worked the rope, the familiar creak of the pulley, a mournful cry in the stillness. The bucket rose, dripping cool, clear life onto the dusty ground. He brought it to her, his shadow falling over her small form. She flinched, her eyes widening with a fresh wave of fear, her hand tightening over her wound. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." He knelt beside her, the nearness of her pain a palpable thing. He could smell the metallic tang of her blood, the dust of the trail, the faint, wild scent of sage that clung to her hair. He lifted the heavy wooden bucket, his calloused, weathered hand surprisingly steady, and pressed its rim to her cracked lips. She drank. At first, She sipped hesitantly, her eyes never leaving his face, searching for the lie, the trap. Then, as the cool liquid soothed her parched throat, a desperate greed took over. She drank like a woman being saved from the fires of hell, her small hands coming up to grip the bucket, her body shuddering with the sheer relief of it. Elias held it steady, watching the water spill down her chin and darken the front of her dowskin dress. He watched as a flicker of life, of strength, returned to those fierce dark eyes. And in that moment, as he knelt in the dust of his self-imposed exile, giving water to a wounded stranger who should have been his enemy, Elias Thorne knew one thing for certain. He had just invited the world, with all its noise and trouble and blood, back into his life. He had just changed everything. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this simple act of mercy was a stone tossed into a silent pool, and the ripples would soon become a tidal wave, threatening to drown him and everything he had ever built. This wounded girl was not just any member of the local tribes, and the trouble that followed her was far more dangerous than a simple posse. The men who had put a bullet in her side were not far behind, and when they arrived, they would bring with them a storm that would make the lonely silence of Elias's ranch feel like a paradise lost. The girl, whose name he did not know, drank until the first bucket was empty, her body seeming to draw life directly from the water. Elias refilled it without a word, his movements methodical, his mind a whirlwind of recrimination and a strange, unfamiliar sense of purpose. He watched as the color began to seep back into her face, a faint flush beneath the layers of dust and grime. It was only then, as the initial urgency of her thirst was slaked, that he allowed himself to truly examine her wound. It was not the ragged tear of an animal's claw or the clean puncture of a stray arrow. It was a bullet hole. The edges of the wound were seared and darkened with powder burns, a telltale sign of a shot fired at close, almost intimate range. This was no hunting accident. This was an execution that had failed. The realization landed in his gut like a cold stone. Whoever had done this had meant for her to die, and people who went to such lengths to kill someone rarely gave up after the first attempt. They would be tracking her. They would be following that same damning blood trail that had led her to his well, to him. They might be riding toward his property right now, their rifles loaded and their minds devoid of mercy. The girl seemed to sense the shift in his thoughts. Her drinking slowed, and she lowered the bucket, her breath still shallow but more regular. With an effort that made her whole body tremble, she raised a hand, no longer reaching for water, but pointing. She pointed toward the vast, empty horizon to the east, the direction from which she had come. Then, with a stark and brutal clarity, she drew her finger across her own throat. The message was unmistakable. Danger was coming, and it was coming soon. Elias's heart, a slow and steady drum for 10 years, began to hammer against his ribs. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him, "Drag her away. Hide the body if she dies. Erase the bloodstains. Burn the evidence. Pretend this moment never happened." But he looked at her, at the raw courage it took for her to warn him even as her own life bled out into the dust, and he found he could not move. She could barely sit up, let alone walk. Moving her now would be a death sentence, and leaving her here was like hanging a sign on his gate that read, "Trouble welcome here." That's when he heard it. It started as a vibration in the soles of his boots, a faint tremor in the earth. Then it grew into a sound, the sound that had haunted the nights of settlers for generations, the distant, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, multiple horses. At least a half-dozen, riding hard and fast, their pace one of urgency, not of casual travel. They were coming straight for his ranch. The girl heard them too. The flicker of life in her eyes was instantly extinguished. replaced by a profound and primal fear. She tried to push herself up, to make herself smaller, to blend into the stones of the well, as if invisibility were an act of will. The movement tore at her wound, and a fresh wave of crimson soaked through her fingers where she pressed them against her side. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elias. He grabbed the empty bucket and, in a frantic motion, doused the most obvious bloodstains on the ground, turning the red dust to dark, damning mud. But it was a futile gesture. There was no time. The riders would be cresting the nearby ridge in minutes, perhaps seconds. He looked from the approaching dust cloud back to the wounded girl. This stranger, this child, had stumbled into his life, and in the space of a single afternoon had laid siege to the fortress of his solitude. Her presence could get them both killed. And yet, as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he had never expected to see. In an Apache warrior staring down what she must have assumed was her end at the hands of a white man. Gratitude. It was pure, unvarnished, and it cut through his fear with the clean edge of a knife. The hoofbeats were louder now, a thunderous announcement of their arrival. He had to make a choice. In a split second, a dozen frantic plans flashed through his mind. The old root cellar behind the barn. It was dark, hidden. If he could get her there. He reached down, his hands hooking under her arms to lift her. "Come on," he grunted, his voice strained. "We have to hide you." But she grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. Her eyes were no longer fixed on him, but on the ridge where the riders were about to appear. And then she did something that made the fine hairs on Elias's neck stand on end. She smiled. It was not the grateful smile of a moment ago. It was a knowing smile, a thin, grim curve of her lips that said she understood exactly who was coming for her, and why. The riders crested the ridge like a storm cloud, bringing lightning, 6 of them, their forms dark against the bright afternoon sky. They moved with the brutal efficiency of men for whom violence was a trade. Elias recognized the lead rider instantly, and his blood ran cold. Marshal Dixon Fuller was less a lawman and more a force of nature, a man whose reputation for casual brutality preceded him into every saloon and settlement from here to the Kansas border. Fuller was the kind of man who shot first and let God sort out the details, especially when it came to Indian troubles. He was known to collect scalps as trophies and call it justice. A man who would burn a ranch to the ground on sheer suspicion. Elias instinctively moved, positioning his body in front of the well, trying to shield the girl from view. He forced his hands to unclench, to hang loosely at his sides, adopting the posture of a man with nothing more pressing on his mind than the heat of the day. His mouth was as dry as desert sand. Fuller reined in his horse a mere 10 feet away, close enough for Elias to see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The other 5 men fanned out, creating a loose, inescapable semicircle, their hands resting casually on their holstered pistols. This was not a social call. "Afternoon, Thorne," Fuller said, his voice a lazy drawl that dripped with condescension. He didn't dismount, preferring the advantage of height. "We're tracking a wounded renegade. Blood trail leads right to your property." Elias felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple. He fought to keep his own voice even. "Haven't seen any renegades, Marshal. Been working on the south fence line all day." Fuller's eyes, chips of ice, swept across the ranch, missing nothing. His gaze lingered for a heartbeat on the dark, muddy patches of ground near the well. Elias's stomach plunged. "That so?" Fuller dismounted slowly, deliberately, his spurs jingling a deathly tune. He sauntered closer, his boots stirring up little puffs of dust. "Because that sure looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've taken to butchering your cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say you've had a recent visitor." Behind Elias, Hidden by the low stone wall, the girl remained preternaturally still, but he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. One sound, one sudden movement, and they were both dead men. Fuller took 3 more steps, his hand now resting openly on the butt of his pistol. "You know the penalty for harboring fugitives, don't you, Thorne?" The question was rhetorical, a cat playing with a cornered mouse. "It's the same penalty as for treason. A rope around your neck, a long dance on a short drop." The words hung in the air, a palpable threat. Elias felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring. He was trapped. Any sudden move would expose the girl, and the moment Fuller saw her, the bullets would fly. His mind raced, searching for an escape that didn't exist. It was then that the impossible happened. The wounded girl spoke. Her voice, though weakened by her injury, was clear and strong, and it flowed in a stream of melodic, guttural words. It was not English. It was the pure, undiluted tongue of the Apache. The sound of it seemed to strike Marshal Fuller like a physical blow. He froze mid-step, the swagger draining from him, replaced by a slack-jawed astonishment. The color vanished from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. His hand, which had been so confidently resting on his pistol, fell away as if the weapon had suddenly become red-hot. "Dear God," Fuller whispered, the words barely audible, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. You're her." The effect on his men was no less dramatic. They dismounted as one, their weapons forgotten, their faces a mixture of profound shock and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. But it wasn't the fear a man shows when facing an enemy. It was the dawning, stomach-turning horror of a man who realizes he has just made a catastrophic, career-ending, life-altering mistake. Fuller turned to Elias, his face now as pale as winter snow, his eyes wide with a terror that Elias had never imagined the ruthless lawman capable of feeling. "Do you have any idea," Fuller stammered, his voice cracking, "who you've been helping?" Elias stared at Marshal Fuller's terrified face, his mind spinning like a wagon wheel stuck in mud. In 12 years on the frontier, he'd seen the man face down outlaws, grizzly bears, and even a small war party of Cheyenne dog soldiers, without so much as a tremor in his hand. But now, Fuller looked like a man who had seen a ghost walk out of its grave. The wounded girl, leaning heavily against the stone well, spoke again. This time, her voice cut through the thick, tense air, in perfect, unaccented English. It was a voice that carried an innate authority, a quiet power that seemed to fill the entire ranch yard, silencing the whisper of the wind. "Tell him who I am, Marshal," she commanded, her dark eyes fixed on the stammering lawman. "Tell him why you rode so hard to find me. Tell him whose orders you were following." Fuller's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He looked from the girl to his dumbfounded men, then back to Elias, as if searching for some escape from the trap that had just snapped shut around him. When he finally found his voice, it was the voice of a broken man. This is Nita," he said, the name spoken like a curse. "Daughter of Chief Black Hawk of the White Mountain Apache." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "She's the one who negotiated the peace accord with the territorial government last spring." The ground seemed to shift beneath Elias's feet. The peace accord, the treaty that had ended 3 years of brutal, bloody warfare between the settlers and the Apache. The treaty that had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives on both sides. The treaty that had finally made it possible for families to settle in this territory without the constant, gnawing fear of midnight raids and burning homesteads. He had been giving water to the architect of that peace. But the pieces didn't fit. If she was a peacemaker, a diplomat revered by both sides, why was she here, bleeding from a bullet wound and running for her life? There was an ambush. Nita continued, her voice still labored from the pain in her side, but growing stronger with every word, fueled by a cold, righteous fury. 3 days ago, a secret meeting with Colonel Albright to discuss expanding the treaty, to secure the water rights for my people along the Silver Creek. But the colonel had other plans. Fuller's face went from pale to a mottled gray. Colonel Albright is dead, he stated flatly, reciting the official story like a catechism. Shot in the back during a renegade Apache attack 3 days ago. You, girl, are wanted for his murder. Because that is the lie your masters want you to believe, Nita countered, pushing herself straighter, her chin lifting in defiance. Albright wasn't killed by my people. He was killed by white men wearing our war paint, speaking just enough of our language to fool the witnesses from a distance. Men who were paid by the one person who stood to lose everything if that treaty was expanded, Silas Croft. The name hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Silas Croft, the railroad baron, a man whose wealth was matched only by his ruthlessness. He had been trying for years to drive a spur line straight through the heart of the Apache lands, a route that the treaty expressly forbade. The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. This wasn't just a murder, it was a conspiracy. Someone had staged the colonel's death to frame Nita, to shatter the peace, and to start a new Indian war. A war from which men like Silas Croft stood to make a fortune in land grants and government contracts. Who sent you, Marshal? Nita's voice was sharp as flint. Was it Croft himself? Did he promise you a share of the profits when the land is cleared and the bodies are buried? Fuller took a step backward, his hand unconsciously moving toward his pistol before he stopped himself, remembering the audience he now had. You're talking treason, he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. Corruption, at the highest levels. Those are dangerous accusations. And they will remain mere accusations if I do not reach the Apache Council by sunrise tomorrow, Nita replied, her gaze unwavering. Which is why they need me dead, why they put a bullet in me and left me for the buzzards, why they sent you to finish the job they started, counting on a greedy lawman to clean up their mess. Elias watched the exchange with a growing sense of dread. He had thought he was just helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he had stumbled into the very heart of a conspiracy that could plunge the entire territory back into a cycle of bloodshed and fire. But what chilled him most was the dawning, horrific realization. Marshal Fuller hadn't come to his ranch to arrest a fugitive. He had come to commit a murder for hire. The silence that followed was taut enough to snap. Fuller's 5 men shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their weapons, their eyes darting between their commander and the wounded girl who had just accused the most powerful man in the territory of treason. Elias could see the war raging behind Fuller's pale eyes. The marshal was trapped between his orders and the truth, between his greed and his fear of exposure. And Elias knew that men like Fuller didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. Even if what you're saying is true, Fuller said slowly, his mind clearly working, searching for a way out. I have my orders. You are a wanted fugitive. My duty is to bring you back, dead or alive. Dead would be far more convenient for you, wouldn't it? Nita replied, her voice laced with ice. Dead women can't testify. Dead women can't reveal which territorial marshal has been taking bribes from Silas Croft to look the other way while he supplied rifles to the renegade bands, fanning the flames of the very conflicts he was supposed to be stopping. The words struck Fuller like a hammer blow. His face, which had been a mask of fear, was now contorted with the rage of a man who has been perfectly and completely exposed. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a young deputy with honest eyes and a face that hadn't yet been hardened by the frontier, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, the young Deputy Bradley began. "If she's telling the truth about the bribes—" "Shut up, Bradley!" Fuller snapped, his authority fraying at the edges. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and that's when Nita played her final, devastating card. With trembling fingers, she reached into a small leather pouch at her belt, a pouch Elias hadn't noticed before. From it, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, stained dark with her own blood. She held it up for all to see. "This is why they tried to kill me," she said, her voice ringing with triumph. "A letter, written by Colonel Albright the night before he was killed. He suspected he was being set up. He gave this to me for safekeeping." Fuller stared at the blood-stained paper as if it were a venomous snake. "What does it say?" he breathed. "It says," Nita announced, her voice carrying to every man in the yard, "that he had discovered who was behind the conspiracy. It lists names, dates, the amounts of the bribes paid. Enough evidence to see a dozen men, including Silas Croft, hang from the gallows." Her eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Fuller's. "And it includes detailed proof that a certain United States Marshal has been on Croft's payroll for the last 2 years. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The birds fell silent. Elias felt his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden dead quiet. He was witnessing the complete and utter destruction of a powerful man. He saw Fuller's mind calculating the odds, weighing the risks, and realizing with dawning horror that there was no way out. The evidence was irrefutable. His career was over. His life was forfeit. "You're lying," Fuller whispered, but his voice lacked any conviction. "Am I?" Nita held up the letter again. "Albright trusted me enough to give me this. He told me if anything happened to him, I was to get it to Fort Grant. He said it was his insurance." Fuller took a step forward, his hand now gripping his pistol, desperation overriding his fear. "Give me that letter." "So you can destroy it?" Nita shook her head. "I don't think so, Marshal. But I will make you an offer. Let me live. Let me walk away from here. And I will make sure your name is the last one on the list to be revealed. It might buy you enough time to run." The offer hung in the air, a final, poisoned temptation. But Deputy Bradley, the young man with the honest eyes, suddenly dismounted. He walked slowly toward the well, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Marshal," Bradley said, his voice firm, "I've been thinking. Remember that shipment of Gatling guns that went missing from the Army depot 3 months ago? The one we were told was stolen by an Apache raid?" Fuller's face darkened. "What about it, Bradley?" "I saw one of those guns 2 weeks ago," the deputy continued, his face flushed with a mixture of courage and terror. "Mounted on a wagon belonging to Silas Croft's surveying team. It made me wonder who was really stealing from who." The admission cracked something open. Suddenly, the other deputies were nodding, exchanging glances, remembering other inconsistencies, other orders that hadn't made sense at the time. A suspicious fire at a trading post, a key witness in a land dispute who disappeared without a trace. In the space of a minute, without firing a single shot, Nita had turned Fuller's own men against him. But Fuller was not the kind of man to go down without a fight. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Elias saw the exact moment the marshal decided that bullets were a simpler solution than truth. "You're all fools," Fuller snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping away to reveal the feral beast beneath. "You think anyone will believe this savage's word against mine? You think they'll take the testimony of a dead Indian and a handful of traitors?" He drew his pistol in one smooth, lightning-fast motion, the barrel swinging toward Nita. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into the line of fire, his own weapon raised. "Stand down, Marshal!" The words cracked like thunder across the ranch. The other 3 deputies followed Bradley's lead, their guns now trained, on their own commanding officer. Only one man, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, who looked as corrupt as his boss, remained loyal to Fuller. "You're making a mistake that will cost you your lives," Fuller hissed, sweat now beading on his forehead. "Maybe," Bradley replied, his hands steady. "But I've made enough mistakes following your orders. I won't make another." Elias watched the standoff, his heart in his throat. 7 armed men in his ranch yard, all pointing guns at each other. This was how range wars started. This was how good men died for bad reasons. And then Nita did something entirely unexpected. She began to sing. It was not a war cry, but a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ancient Apache words carried across the yard, a song of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stand together against the darkness. The effect was startling. The deputies, mesmerized by the sound, lowered their weapons slightly. Even Fuller seemed momentarily transfixed. And while they listened, distracted by the unearthly beauty of the song, Elias realized with a jolt of ice-cold dread what she was truly doing. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind to ears that knew how to listen. She wasn't just singing, she was summoning her people. The melody ended. Silence fell once more, heavier and more profound than before. And in that silence, Elias heard it again. Hoofbeats. Distant, but growing closer. Not 6 riders this time. Not a dozen. It sounded like an entire army. Fuller heard them too. His face went pale as moonlight. "How many?" he breathed, his question directed at Nita. She smiled, the same grim, knowing smile as before. "Enough." The sound grew from a rumble to a roar, a wave of thunder rolling across the plains. The ground itself began to tremble. And then they appeared. They came over the horizon like a vision from a forgotten world. 50, perhaps 100 Apache warriors on horseback, their forms silhouetted against the dying sun. They moved in perfect, silent formation, an unstoppable tide of retribution. An entire tribe was riding toward his ranch, and they would arrive within minutes. Fuller raised his pistol again, the madness of a cornered man in his eyes. This time, he pointed it directly at Elias's chest. "You did this!" he shrieked. "You helped her signal them." "I gave a dying woman a cup of water," Elias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Same as I do for any creature suffering on my land." The hoofbeats were deafening now, the earth shaking beneath their feet, and Marshal Fuller finally understood. This was not just the end of his career. This was the end of his life. They came not as a storm, but as a judgment. The Apache warriors, led by a chief whose face was a mask of stoic fury, formed a wide, silent circle around the ranch, their presence an overwhelming weight. Their weapons remained sheathed, but their eyes promised death. Chief Black Hawk, Nita's father, dismounted and strode toward the well where his daughter waited, his every step a testament to a lifetime of command. He embraced her, his weathered hands checking her wound, his face a mixture of grief and rage. When their conversation in their native tongue was finished, the chief turned to face Fuller, his eyes like chips of black obsidian. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. "Marshal Fuller, my daughter tells me you came here today to murder her on the orders of the man who killed Colonel Albright." It was not a question. It was a verdict. The chief gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. From it, he produced a stack of papers. "Your correspondence with Silas Croft," the chief continued, his voice cold as a grave. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie. Colonel Albright was more thorough than you knew. We have all the proof we need." Fuller's world collapsed. He looked from the damning letters to the 50 warriors surrounding him, to the faces of his own men who had turned against him. It was over. But a cornered rat will always bite. With a final, desperate scream of rage, he swung his pistol toward the chief. "If I'm going to hell, I'm taking you with me." What happened next moved faster than thought. Nita threw herself in front of her father. 50 Apache lances were raised as one, but the shot never came. Because Elias Thorne, a simple rancher who just wanted to be left alone, had tackled Marshall Fuller from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and fury. The dust settled like a curtain falling on the final act of a play. Fuller lay motionless, knocked unconscious by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both the marshal and his last remaining loyal man, Hawkins. The Apache warriors, seeing the threat neutralized, slowly lowered their weapons. But it was what happened next that would stay with Elias for the rest of his life. Chief Black Hawk walked slowly to where Elias sat, catching his breath in the dirt. The old man's weathered face, a roadmap of 100 battles and 1,000 sorrows, showed no expression as he studied the white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger. Then, without warning, the chief placed both his hands on Elias's shoulders. He spoke in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, of honor, of a sacred recognition. Nita, leaning on the arm of a young warrior, translated, her own voice thick with emotion. "He says you are now a brother to our people," she whispered. "He says that what you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for the truth, choosing courage over fear, these are the actions of a true warrior. He says our home is your home. Our people are your people, from this day until the end of days." Elias felt something shift in his chest. A door that had been locked and barred for a decade, creaking open to let in a light he had never expected to see again. All his life, he'd been taught that the Apache were savages, enemies, obstacles. But looking into the chief's ancient, wise eyes, he saw only dignity and a kind of profound respect he had never earned from his own people. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Apache prepared to depart. Nita's wound had been treated by the tribal medicine man. She would live. The peace treaty, saved by her courage and a stranger's compassion, would be honored. Before mounting his horse, she came to Elias one last time. "You saved more than my life today, Elias Thorne," she said, her hand briefly touching his. "You saved the future for both our peoples." "I just gave a thirsty girl some water," Elias replied, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. She smiled, a true and brilliant smile that lit up her face. "Sometimes," she said, "that is how the world changes, one cup of water at a time." By morning, they were gone. The ranch was silent once more, but it was no longer the oppressive, empty silence of grief. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the echo of a song and the promise of a new beginning. In a world full of hatred and fear, a simple act of human decency had worked a miracle. The lonely rancher was no longer alone. He was a brother, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was home. If this story of courage and unexpected kinship moved your heart, if it reminded you that even in the most brutal of landscapes, compassion can build a bridge between two worlds, then this is the place for you. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of the Old West, where honor is worth more than gold, and true strength is measured not by the gun you carry, but by the mercy you show. Click that subscribe button and never miss a story where the courage to choose compassion over fear changes the world.